friends. It's good to have you with us. I had an interesting thing happen this week. I had a well-known scientist, a friend of mine, who many of you would know his name, who is attached to an organization that every one of you would know the name of, who took me to task over some things that we had put in Future Edition. And said that they could easily be rebutted with simple fact-checking. That here's Reuters. It was fascinating because I've had a little bit of an interchange with this guy, and he lives in a different world. He's a really smart guy, PhD and all that kind of stuff. And there is a reality that he is not aware of. This is a little bit like the kind of the parallel universe business that we've chatted about in the past, and that, people see one world one way and people see the world another way. But what I want to talk to you about is kind of the mechanics of how a good part of that works. So let me start by taking you back to 2001. In 2001, I was asked by the editor of the scientific journal to review a book. This is a peer-reviewed scientific journal. And there's my review down there at the bottom. The name of the book was The Missing Times: News Media Complicity in the UFO Cover-Up. This turned out to be a seminal event in my lifetime, because I read this book, and let me just read for you a couple of things that I wrote from this review. A couple of months ago, there were some new findings in science that repealed a physical law that I had been taught was universal in engineering school. It was the way reality always worked. That event was a reminder that all of the things that we take for granted in science are only temporary assumptions about how the physical reality works. They're always subject to new discoveries and theories that will surely come in the future. Our understanding of reality may be conditional in science, but we bet on it in the short run, assuming that what we believe is true. It's great to believe we know what we think we know. It provides stability, sanity, authority, employment, and even uninterrupted sleep at night. If everything, or even a significant portion of what we are told by others is suspect, well, then it starts to be like the Matrix or the Soviet Union in the early 80s, where nobody believed the media. Rumors carried the day, and everyone had so lost faith in the government that they became expert at reading between the lines, 3 levels deep, to try to figure out what really was happening at any distance greater than one's personal line of sight. Very socially corrosive. Fortunately, that isn't the case here in the U.S. Here we have independent press that balances the government's penchant for secrecy, and on balance, Americans have a pretty good idea about what is going on, right? Well, what would it take to convince you that the press and the government are in cahoots in feeding the populace the government line on things deemed to involve national security? How about a systematic construction of how, since World War I, the British and then the American governments have increasingly put into place the perception management, the propaganda, the perception management mechanisms to do just that. Designed at the same time to feed propaganda and disinformation to the enemy during the war times, and a contrived picture of conflict for domestic consumption. The intelligence service has always reached out to the pros in communications, journalists, to head up those operations during the war. After the war, the news executives went back to running the networks, and the newspapers supposedly now committed to objectively questioning government and providing an independent oversight function. It was here that I became aware of Project Mockingbird. Fair Observer describes it this way. Project Mockingbird was a secret campaign by the United States Central Intelligence Agency to influence media. It was begun in the 1950s. It was originally organized by Cord Meyer and Alan Dulles and was later led by Frank Wisner after Dulles became the head of the CIA. The idea was this. The idea was that they would take the people who had been in the intelligence service in the OSS in the Second World War, and these young guys, a lot of them, most of them are from the Ivy League schools, and they needed jobs after the war. And so the new CIA would get them jobs in the major media thing, CBS, RCA, New York Times, and so on. Now you might say, how does that work? Why would somebody do that? Why would they do that? Have you ever studied at all or remembered a little bit maybe about the mechanics of how you take over a country? How the CIA, as they've done 85 times attempts in the last, 75 years or something like that, when they try to take over a country or dispose an existing leader, what is the first thing that they do after they get some people on the ground? The first thing they do is they go capture the television station and the radio stations. That's what they do. That's the number one thing. Because once they do that, then they can control the messaging that goes out to the people. And they can shape the only reality that these folks have, because everything they know about, as I said in that review, everything you know that's not in front of your face gets mediated. It comes from somewhere else. And if you can control that vehicle, that broadcast capability, that communications platform, then you control what everybody believes on the back end. And so Project Mockingbird was led by these guys, and they set up a network to help present the CIA's views and funded some student cultural organizations and magazines as fronts. As it developed, it also worked to influence foreign media and political campaigns. Of course, that's what it was supposed to be in the first place. Was the only thing that the CIA was supposed to do is work offshore. In addition to activities from other units of the CIA, it was supposed to support other things. In addition to earlier exposés of CIA activities in foreign affairs, in 1965, Ramparts magazine published an article revealing that the National Student Association was funded by the CIA. The United States Congress investigated the allegations, and they published a report in 1976. 1976 is an important date, as you'll see here in a minute. Other accounts were also published. The media operation was first called Mockingbird in Deborah Davis's 1979 book, Catherine the Great, Catherine Graham and her Washington Post empire. Catherine Graham was the publisher, the owner of the Washington Post. Back to my report. It's one thing to make these assertions, but Hansen, he's the author of the book, brick upon brick builds the foundation for the argument that once back in the news business, these executives, particularly at places like CBS and the New York Times, continued to be responsive to, if not take directions from the intelligence and military leadership on sensitive subjects. Hansen shows how this relationship worked during the war years, and then provides tangible proof of how the manipulation process worked in the UFO area. Now, that all was just kind of theoretically, mind-blowingly theoretical to me at the time. In the middle 80s or so, late 80s, could have been the early part of the 90s, I can't remember exactly, I got to know Bill Colby. Bill Colby was the former director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and the reason why he and I became friends was because when he got out of the government, out of the CIA, he was a liberal in his outlook, and he was very interested in trying to reduce the defense budget, because at the time the U.S. defense budget was more than every other country in the world combined. And I too was interested in that, and so we ended up together a good bit, and he was a friend. I've been to his house, lots of things. Now, Bill Colby was a very interesting man. I mean, now, this is a guy, and we don't have the time here to go through all of his history, but Bill Colby was a warrior, a genuine warrior. But Colby was a very devout Catholic and felt very strongly about the tenets of integrity and honesty and other such kinds of things. And it was for this reason that, he came out and started running around giving speeches talking about how that the defense budget ought to be reduced. And I mean, that was kind of heretical. Did not make him very many friends. And Bill was known as a media-friendly CIA director. His tenure at DCI, he was only there for 2.5 years, was tumultuous and was overshadowed by the Church and Pike congressional investigations into alleged U.S. intelligence malfeasance over the preceding 25 years, including 1975, the so-called Year of Intelligence. That's why you watch here about what happens in 1975. Now, consider this. Bill Colby's the director of Central Intelligence who keeps the biggest secrets of this government. And what happened was he cooperated with this congressional committee, not out of a desire for a major overhaul of the organization, but in the belief that the actual scope of such misdeeds, encapsulated by the so-called family jewels, he went to the leadership of the CIA and said, I want a list of all of the family jewels, the worst things that we've done, that if it became public would really be damaging to the organization. And then he went off and made them all public. And he did this because he believed enough, thought that these family jewels would justify lasting damage to the CIA's reputation if they ever came out, and it was likely they would. And he also believed that the CIA had a moral and legal obligation to cooperate with Congress and demonstrate that the CIA was accountable to the Constitution. That's huge, that kind of concept. You can't think, there is no politician, there is no major political leader or organizational head in this country that says that. That says that the biggest keeper of secrets and that he felt obliged, not only for the well-being of the organization overall, but also because it was the right thing to do. He was a man of an amazing kind of integrity in that regard. On a more practical level, he also believed that cooperating with the Congress was the only way to save the agency from dissolution within a period of great congressional strength. This openness policy caused a major rift within the CIA ranks, as you can well imagine, with many old-time officers, such as former DCI Richard Helms, believing that the CIA should have resisted the congressional intrusion. Some of the people inside the agency thought he was a Russian mole or some other kind of thing. I mean, they really disliked having their secrets told. Bill presumably said this. He was quoted in a book. It's hard to tell for sure whether he said it or not, but it's likely true in any case. He says the CIA owns every one of any significance in the major media. Just Security says about the CIA and the abuses. You know, those 36 things he talked about. Have you ever heard of MK Ultra? That's because Bill Colby told them about that. And there are a number of, assassination things, all kinds of stuff that were part of those committee hearings that are not common knowledge now and inform us about how the intelligence services work and parts of our government work that we never would have known without. Just Security talks about this. It said it was left to the incoming DCI Colby to give Congress voluntarily a list of 693 single-spaced pages known as the family jewels, or the skeletons, that showed how the agency had violated its charter for 25 years by spying on Americans, reading their tax returns, tapping their telephones, and opening their mail. Not only had it plotted to murder foreign leaders such as Castro, it also conducted LSD mind control experiments on both witting and unwilling and willing American human guinea pigs. The whole 60s revolution was contrived and managed by the CIA. Woodstock was a CIA op. The wavy gravy who was on the stage telling everybody about what kind of pills to take and don't do this one and how to do it, and the guys that were out handing out stuff all over in the muddy fields out there were CIA operatives. They're from the MK Ultra program. It was a systematic kind of effort to try to see what large-scale implications, effects of hallucinogenics were. There are very interesting reasons to believe that a lot of the New Age movement was generated by the CIA back then. One of my great friends was Willis Harman, who was one of the early presidents of the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And what the declassified kind of reports now suggest is that before he went to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, Willis Harman was worked at SRI, where the remote viewing program and stuff was. And he headed up a study that included Dwayne Elgin and Oliver Markley and a bunch of other guys who are friends of mine or well-known, or fairly well-known names now, to study where the society was going and where large-scale, where the big movements in social area were going. And when he was finished and put that whole thing together, which was funded by the CIA, he then, when he came over to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, gave it to Marilyn Ferguson, and she wrote it up into Aquarian Conspiracy, which was a hugely influential book. Now, I'm not going to try to argue about the merits of the Aquarian Conspiracy or any number of the other kind of things that were going on, but the point is that the CIA they had Richard Alpert, who became Ram Dass. All of them were funded. They worked for the CIA. It's extraordinary and kind of mind-blowing when you get into the middle of this stuff and you look at how their reach and their influence. We found all of that out because of Bill Colby and what he did. Not only had it plotted to murder foreign leaders such as Castro, it also conducted LSD mind control experiments. On December 1974, Colby's briefing about the scandals to the Justice Department included 18 issues deemed to be of legal concern. These, he reported, were due to very compartmentalized organizational structure used by his predecessor, Richard Helms, in which it was possible for units within the agency to have no knowledge at all about what other units were doing. Here's the Church Committee hearings. This is Frank Church, and that's John Tower. Here's Bill Colby. And in the Church Committee hearings in 1975, what Bill Colby told them was that the CIA has embedded employees in all of the major media organizations. And the purpose of these folks was to kill stories that did not support the CIA interests and to support and promote stories that did. When Frank Church asked him, how many people do you have that work for you, that are paid for you, that are function in this way, that are in the media organizations, he said, more than 800 people. That was in 1975. And now the best estimate, a book I read a couple of years ago, is that about 2,500 CIA employees are embedded in every major media outlet in the world. And it's that source estimated that a third of the CIA budget was used just to support this network of propagandists everywhere. Because, like I said, if you want to take over and run a political organization or a bunch of people, if you can control what they see, what they hear, what they believe, how they presented the supposed reality of the world, you've got them. because they have no other choice and they have no other sources. By the way, that was until the internet, the advent of the internet. So let me go back and just finish this up. So you say to yourself, so what does that mean that, they've got all these people embedded? Well, Russia Insider had an exclusive interview with a Dutch journalist, a guy named Eric van de Beek. He interviewed the senior German editor who was causing a sensation at the time. That was about 2014. With his allegations that the CIA pays German media professionals to spin stories to follow the U.S. government. He wrote about this 2 weeks ago, and the article shot up in views, becoming one of the most read articles on that whole site. Here's his picture, Udo Ufkat. He reveals that in his best-selling book, Bought Journalists, how he was taught to lie, to betray, and not to tell the truth to the public. The former editor of one of Germany's largest newspapers, he was secretly on the payroll of the CIA and the German Secret Service, spinning the news in a way that was positive for the U.S. and bad for its opponents. In his latest interview, he alleges that some of the media are nothing more than propaganda outlets of political parties, secret services, and international think tanks and high finance entities. So, what is a bought journalist? Well, we're talking about puppets on a string, he said. Journalists who write and say whatever their masters tell them to write and say. If you see how the mainstream media is reporting about the Ukraine conflict and you know what's really going on, you get the picture. The masters in the background are pushing for a war with Russia, and Western journalists are putting on their helmets. Kind of fascinating, for me at least, background about how this whole thing works. Once you get a fix on how this all works, then you look for things. And you try to, it's like having a hypothesis, right? And doing a scientific study or an experiment and trying to find things that support the hypothesis. And it's fascinating because I've been looking at this for years now and trying to see how the messaging kind of transmits its way and propagates it across the system. And their system has about 3 different levels to it. And up until Trump, they never gave themselves away. And it was very hard to see and understand what the story was, because there were no that they were promoting. And you could always see in one of the major papers or something that would either defend or not, not publish something that you heard about later and so on. But there was no kind of pattern. But when Trump came in, then it solidified. And it's solidified in a very interesting way, like I say, where it's obvious that there are about 3 levels of kind of puppetry going on, this puppetry system. And at the high level, there's the New York Times and the Washington Post and Foreign Policy magazine and Time and Newsweek and it just whole bunches of all of these major things, and also a company called Sinclair Broadcasting. I used to know one of the brothers that owns Sinclair. It's the biggest company. That it owns more television stations in the United States than any other company. And if you kind of monitor the landscape, and there's a whole lot more Huffington Post. There's a whole bunch underneath in that group. It's not just the few that I just mentioned, but you get the sense of it. If you if you monitor, if you watch this, what you can see is almost concurrently uh, a certain message using certain words will all of a sudden pop up everywhere within a day and a half, something like that. And suddenly you have the same talking points. They come out of the White House, they come out of this, they come out of the papers, they come, and everywhere it's saying the same thing. Now, some of you, I'm sure, have seen those video clips. They're from about the Sinclair system with all these television news people all saying exactly the same thing. Just dozens and dozens of them all just repeating verbatim the same statement. And that's the CIA. That's the CIA pushing their stories one way or another. The whole kind of Russiagate thing, and that Russia, gotten into and colluded with Trump was all made up and just over and over and over. They say it over and over again. After a while, all people believe it. They really just buy into the whole thing. If the issue is really pressing and they really need to get something, then there's a second level. There's a bunch of pundits. There's a bunch of individuals who then get activated. And suddenly you start to see not only the high-level media, but then there's this layer of guys that otherwise had really not been seemingly playing in the space. And they come out with the same thing, with the same words, with the same concepts coming at it. And if it's really important that they try to get this thing out, then they got another level down below, which is just, columnists of regional newspapers and things that people that you just would really not ever think were part of this overall kind of organization in this operation. And suddenly they expose themselves because they all start saying the same thing using the same kind of words. So, if you're my scientist friend and you find what I publish in future edition to be incredible because it flies in the face of the common information that is generated out of the science community and out of the federal government about COVID, of course. And you respond and say, all this stuff can be debunked about that fast because all you have to do is look at Reuters and then you look at this and then you say, this is a circular argument. This is a circular relationship. You're asking the guys who are pitching the stories whether it's true or not, and they then have this little fact checking process mechanism and they say, of course it's not true, and you come and tell me, and you expect somebody with a PhD and that's smart that they'd be a little more questioning about the system, and they'd know more about the system to be able to kind of question it. If you found that helpful and interesting, and you haven't done so already, why don't you just click on the link below and give us your email so that we can send you alerts for the next segments of PostScript. We'd love to be able to tell you beforehand when things are coming downstream so you don't have to go look for them. And this is the best way to do that. We assure you that we won't share your information with anyone else. Thanks.